The rancher's world was silence, fences creaking in the wind, a kettle hissing over the fire, no voices but his own. For years, solitude was his only company. But one winter dusk, the horizon darkened with riders. 10 Apaches approached, weary, hollow-eyed, their shadows stretching long against the dying Sunday. They dismounted not with weapons raised, but with hands open, their leader speaking only once. "We ask for shelter." The rancher's rifle trembled in his grasp. He knew the West's law mercy could cost a man his land, his life, even his soul. Yet turning them away might condemn them to death. In that moment, his lonely silence shattered, and the frontier demanded an answer. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The rifle's weight seemed to double in John Mercer's hands as the Apache leader's words hung in the cold dusk, and for one heartbeat he considered slamming the barn doors shut, letting the storm and night finish what hunger and hardship had already begun. But then his eyes swept over the riders, gaunt cheeks hollow from days without food, cracked lips bleeding from wind, children swaying in their mother's arms like brittle reeds, and something inside him, some remnant of decency buried beneath years of suspicion, bent his will like iron under heat. His breath hissed through his teeth as he lowered the barrel, the wooden stock creaking as his hands trembled, and he jerked his head toward the barn with a grunt that was neither welcome nor refusal, just the smallest crack in the wall of silence he had built around himself. The Apaches moved slow, careful, their horses stamping as if they too sensed the fragile balance of mercy and danger, and when they slipped into the shadowed barn, the smell of hay, smoke, and damp wool swallowed them, mingling with the faint tang of blood and sweat. Mercer lit the lantern, its glow painting the faces of his unlikely guests in shifting shades of suspicion and exhaustion, every pair of eyes fixed on him as though waiting for the trick, the bullet, the betrayal they had learned too often to expect. He felt it too, the knot of fear in his gut twisting tighter with each glance. And yet beneath that suspicion flickered something else, gratitude so raw, it shone through the hollow hunger in their gaze, a silent acknowledgement that his single act had given them one more night of life. He tried to busy himself with small motions, dragging out buckets of water, setting an extra log on the fire pit in the barn's corner. But each action carried the heavy air of ceremony, as if mercy itself required ritual to keep from shattering under the strain of mistrust. One of the women unwrapped a bundle, revealing a child so thin Mercer felt his throat close. And though the boy's eyes never left him, the rancher saw the faintest spark return to them as the heat licked higher. The leader, tall and weathered as desert stone, crouched by the firelight, his features unreadable, but when Mercer risked meeting his gaze, he found no mockery there, no scorn, only a grave recognition, as though both men stood on the knife edge of a choice that bound them together whether they willed it or not. Silence stretched, thick with the creak of the barn's rafters and the hiss of sparks, until Mercer could stand it no more and muttered, "It's one night. At dawn, we'll see." His voice harsh from disuse, his words more a shield than kindness. But even that was enough. The leader dipped his head once, a gesture as heavy as any oath. And the barn seemed to exhale, suspicion and gratitude folding together like smoke around the fire, while outside, the prairie wind wailed through the fences, carrying away the last remnants of Mercer's solitude, leaving in its place a fragile and dangerous mercy. The night deepened, wrapping the ranch in a cloak of brittle silence broken only by the low crackle of the fire in the barn and the restless shifting of horses in their stalls, and John Mercer moved with stiff motions as he carried in what little bread he had left, a rough loaf gone hard at the edges, and a bucket brimming with water drawn from his well, the steam of his own breath curling pale in the chill air as he set them down in the hay. The Apache's eyes followed every move, sharp and unblinking, and though no hand strayed toward a weapon, the weight of their presence pressed heavy against him, each heartbeat reminding him that a single word from his neighbors, if they ever learned of this, would brand him a traitor. A man who fed enemies while good settlers bled along the frontier. The law itself would not spare him. For more than one rancher had swung from a rope or rotted in a cell for less than offering food to a band the newspapers painted as raiders and thieves. Yet as he broke the loaf into pieces and passed it out, as he tipped the bucket so cracked lips could drink, he felt a strange heat stir in his chest. Not pride, not rebellion, but the simple, stubborn decency of seeing life preserved where death had been certain. The women tore the bread into smaller bites for their children, pressing it into tiny hands with a tenderness that pulled at Mercer's gut, and the men drank sparingly. Each sip passed along the circle like a sacred thing, until the bucket came back to the leader, who set it down with care rather than greed. Watching them, Mercer's mind swirled with ghosts of old lessons. His father's gravel voice warning that mercy could kill a man quicker than bullets, his neighbor's sneers at weak hearts, and yet here he was, the outlaw of conscience, sharing his table with those the world told him to despise. The barn's lantern light flickering across faces lined by hardship but stripped of malice. Still, unease gnawed him. For every bite they swallowed was another stone laid on his own gallows, and he could not shake the thought of riders cresting the hill, torches in hand, neighbors eager to brand his land cursed and his blood worthless. He shifted where he sat, the edge of his chair digging into his spine, his rifle resting just out of reach though its shadow loomed long across the dirt floor. And as he glanced toward it, he caught the leader's eyes once more, steady and dark, neither demanding nor pleading, but carrying the unspoken weight of men who understood risk, who knew that survival was sometimes a bargain of silence and bread. Mercer tore off a bite of the loaf himself, chewing hard to still his racing thoughts, and in the rhythm of their quiet meal, he felt the fragile thread binding them draw taut. Not trust, not yet, but something raw, a recognition that in this barn, under this roof, the frontier's cruel laws had been defied, if only for one night. When the fire sank low and the last crumbs vanished, the Apaches lay back against the hay, eyes closing but never fully at rest, while Mercer remained awake, staring at the rafters, the weight of hospitality pressing heavier than iron on his chest, knowing that when dawn came, the world would judge him for what he had done, and perhaps worse for what he might yet choose to do again. Dawn broke in pale streaks across the horizon, the frost still clinging to the brittle grass when John Mercer stepped out into the yard, expecting to find his barn emptied by shadows and hoofbeats. But instead he stopped dead, the breath freezing in his chest, for there in the early light the Apaches moved across his fence line like men born to the work, their hands steady and sure as they lifted posts from the dirt and drove them back into place, their sinews flexing with the rhythm of a labor he had thought only his to endure. One leaned his weight against a warped board until it settled straight, another tied new wire with swift, practiced motions, and a boy no older than 15 carried armfuls of scrap wood with the seriousness of a man, his every movement echoing discipline rather than defiance. Mercer stood with his arms crossed tight, suspicion and disbelief warring in his chest, for never had he imagined strangers, least of all Apaches, whom the valley spoke of as destroyers of land, killers of cattle, would treat his fences with a respect deeper than some neighbors had ever shown. He watched as the leader bent low to tamp earth around a post, his broad shoulders straining, his long black hair catching the morning sun, and when he rose, his gaze flicked toward Mercer, not a glance of servitude, nor of defiance, but one that spoke of simple acknowledgement, the silent exchange of men who understood that land lived or died by the hands that worked it. Mercer felt heat creep up his neck at that look, for it stirred in him something he had not known in years, the sensation of not being entirely alone in his endless labor, the crushing solitude of ranch life eased by the sight of others bending their strength beside his. Still, doubt gnawed him, whispering that this was a ruse, that kindness was bait to soften his guard. But as he watched a woman show her child how to pack straw into a gap beneath the barn wall, her voice low and patient, he felt that doubt falter, for deception seldom wore the face of such ordinary care. By mid-morning the fence stood straighter than it had in years, the gaps sealed, the wire taut, and Mercer, who had expected to toil alone until his bones gave out, found himself pacing the edge of the field with arms strangely idle, his chest tight with a mix of gratitude and unease. When the work was done, the Apaches did not ask for food or coin, did not even linger to boast, but returned quietly to the barn's shadow, their movements deliberate and unassuming, as if their effort had been no more than payment for a debt owed, a gesture to balance the fragile scales of mercy given. Mercer swallowed hard, his calloused hands flexing as he considered approaching them, speaking even one word of thanks, but the weight of silence, long his only shield, held him still. So instead he simply stood and watched, his disbelief slowly settling into something far more dangerous: respect, and with it the first fragile thread of trust weaving itself into the fabric of a life he had thought destined to remain forever solitary. Word traveled faster than wildfire across the dry hills, carried on the tongues of passing riders and traders, until by the week's end even the farthest homesteads knew that John Mercer had thrown open his barn to Apaches. And when he rode into town for flour and nails, the air was thick with stares sharp enough to cut hide, whispers snapping like whip cracks from every doorway, until he found himself the unwilling center of every gaze. By the time he stepped through the saloon doors, the truth was already ash in his mouth, for the men within cowhands, ranchers, drifters with dust, ground into their boots, spat tobacco into the sawdust floor, and cursed his name loud enough for him to hear, their voices curling with venom as they barked, "Mercer's harboring savages, and ain't enough rope in the county for that kind of treachery." Mugs slammed down on counters, boots stomped in rhythm, and faces turned toward him twisted, not with curiosity but with outrage. The kind of hatred born not of reason but of fear sharpened into a weapon. He felt the heat of it prickle along his neck. Yet he kept his shoulders square, his jaw clenched, because he knew better than to show weakness in a den where men gathered not for truth but for anger. And as the hours wore on, the whispers grew into talk of law and justice, words twisted to mean whatever suited the loudest mouths, until someone spat the word mob, like a spark tossed into dry tinder, and Mercer's gut turned to stone as the room shifted, men grumbling about torches, about riding out at nightfall to see what kind of devils he'd invited onto his land. The sheriff, slouched in his usual corner, lifted his eyes just once, but he said nothing, only chewed on the end of his cigar as though waiting to see which way the wind would blow, and that silence damned Mercer more than any curse, for it meant there would be no law standing between him and the mob if they came. He left without another word, the sound of chairs scraping and voices rising following him into the dusty street, and as he mounted his horse, he saw clusters of townsfolk gathering in knots, their faces lit by the fever of gossip, some pale with dread, others flushed with fury. And though no rope swung yet from the gallows tree, he could already feel its weight tightening around his throat. The ride home was long and heavy, each hoofbeat pounding the truth deeper into him. His act of mercy had not only bound him to the Apaches in his barn, it had set the whole valley against him, painting his land as a battlefield where fear and hatred would soon come to stake their claim. As the ranch came into view, the fences mended and the smoke curling steady from the chimney, he felt a pang of something sharp and bitter, for what should have been pride now tasted of peril, and he knew that when the sun dipped and shadows stretched long across the plains, the silence of his land would be broken not by the wind, but by the coming thunder of men who carried fire and judgment in their hands. The night pressed heavy against the barn, the wind rattling loose boards like bones, and John Mercer sat on an upturned bucket by the dim firelight, his mind still burning with the venom he'd heard in town, when the Apache leader, who until now had spoken little beyond necessity, shifted from the shadows and fixed him with eyes dark as storm clouds. His voice, roughened by both age and dust, carried weight like stone as he spoke in halting English, each word a struggle but steady enough to carve truth into the silence. Soldiers had come at dawn, blue coats gleaming with steel, rifles barking fire into the camp, and by the time the smoke cleared, their homes were ash, their people scattered like leaves in a storm, women screaming into the wind as children were dragged away, men cut down where they stood, the survivors fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ghosts of what they had lost. Mercer felt his throat tighten as the words painted scenes too raw to ignore, and though the leader's face remained carved of stone, his eyes betrayed the grief of a man who had led his people into the desert not for conquest but because survival was the only path left. "We did not choose your barn," the leader said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "We had no choice, no fire, no food, no ground to stand." He gestured to the women curled with their children in the hay, their bodies worn thin but their gazes still fierce, and then back to the men, who sat cross-legged with quiet vigilance, as though daring the world to try and finish what the soldiers had begun. Mercer swallowed hard, the rifle across his lap suddenly feeling like a confession of its own. for he realized with a jolt that he had been waiting for the catch, for the trick, for the moment when they revealed themselves as raiders or thieves. But instead what he saw was not menace but the raw edge of desperation, a people hunted to the brink and clinging to his roof as the last fragile scrap of safety left to them. Shame pricked him, hot and sharp, for the suspicion he had nursed even as they mended his fence, and he thought of the men in town with their talk of mobs and torches, their thirst for blood blind to the truth that the very army sworn to protect them had already delivered ruin on those now huddled in his barn. The leader's voice dropped lower, almost a growl, not of anger but of sorrow. We bury our dead in silence. We walk on ash. Your fire is all we have left. The words settled like stones in Mercer's chest, heavy enough to crack the shell of doubt he had wrapped around himself. And for the first time he looked at the Apache leader not as a trespasser or burden, but as a man not unlike himself, a man trying to hold together what little remained of his people against forces too vast and merciless to fight. The fire hissed as a log split, sparks rising into the rafters, and in their glow Mercer saw his own reflection in the eyes staring back. Two men caught in a storm neither had chosen, bound now by shelter, by silence, and by the fragile, perilous thread of mercy that might yet mean salvation or destruction for them both. The fire burned low, its glow casting long, twitching shadows across the cabin walls as John Mercer sat hunched forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, his weathered hands pressed against his mouth while his mind tore itself apart on the horns of an impossible choice. Outside, the wind dragged a lonely song across the plains, rattling the loose shutters like a reminder of the silence that had been his only companion for years, the silence he had once thought unbreakable until the night riders came to his door with hollow eyes and voices that asked for nothing but shelter. He could cast them out at dawn, he told himself. Send them back into the desert where hunger and soldiers would finish what fate had already started. And in that choice there would be safety, no torches at his door, no sheriff sharpening his law into a noose, no mob of neighbors ready to brand him traitor to his kind. Yet the thought turned sour in his mouth, for as much as fear tightened its grip on him, another truth gnawed deeper. In the brief days they had been here, his ranch had not felt so empty, not so cursed by silence. The broken fence mended by steady Apache hands, the firelight shared by faces lined with sorrow but alive with stubborn dignity, even the laughter of children too weary to sleep but not too broken to giggle in the hay, these things had stirred something in him he had nearly forgotten, a rhythm of life greater than one man bent alone against the land. Still, he saw in his mind the faces of townsfolk, their jeers and spittle, their eyes gleaming with the joy of cruelty as they whispered of mobs, and he felt the pull of self-preservation like a noose around his neck, reminding him that one misstep on the frontier could damn a man to ruin. He clenched his fists, knuckles whitening, as he tried to measure fear against need, survival against conscience. Yet beneath it all came the deeper whisper, one he could not ignore no matter how he tried. The years of loneliness that had carved hollows in his soul, the endless days of silence broken only by the creak of fences and the hiss of a kettle, the ache in his chest each night when he ate alone with no eyes to meet across the table. Now, for the first time in years, he was not alone. And though danger coiled around it like barbed wire, the thought of returning to that old emptiness weighed heavier than the threat of fire and rope. The flames in the hearth sputtered, shrinking low, and in their fading light he saw his own reflection in the window, a man worn by solitude, hollowed by silence, now caught between the peril of compassion and the safety of abandonment, and as he stared into those tired eyes, he realized that perhaps the greater danger was not the mob or the law, but the thought of becoming once more the man who had nothing but silence to keep him company until death. The fire cracked, sparks leaping like fragile hope, and John Mercer leaned back at last, exhaling slow, his chest heavy with the certainty that whatever choice he made at dawn, it would not be made by fear alone. The crunch of hooves on frozen dirt carried ahead of him, and when Sheriff Amos Harlan rode into the yard, his gray coat flapping like a crow's wings, John Mercer felt the air curdle with the kind of authority that did not need to shout. The sheriff swung down from the saddle slow, his spurs clinking, his jaw locked in a grim set that told Mercer before a word was spoken this was no neighborly visit. And sure enough, When Harlan's boots hit the porch steps, his eyes burned with the weight of the town behind them, his voice low but sharp as barbed wire. "You send them off, John, or the town'll come for you too." The words hung heavy, striking Mercer harder than a fist, for they carried the promise not of justice but of mob law, the kind that didn't wait for trials or reckonings, only fire and rope. And though the sheriff claimed neutrality, his gaze said plain he'd rather be rid of the Apaches himself than waste powder holding back the men he served. Mercer stood in the doorway, rifle leaning just inside, his mouth dry as he searched for an answer that would not betray either the guests huddled in his barn or the neighbors who had once nodded to him in passing. Yet his silence seemed answer enough, for the sheriff's lip curled, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver not in threat but in habit, a man reminding all who watched who carried the law out here. "They've burned our camps, John. Stolen stock, cut men down on the trail." Harlan pressed, his words practiced, his tone the echo of tavern whispers turned into gospel. But Mercer caught the tremor under it. The sheriff had seen the soldiers' handiwork too, and knew well enough that cruelty wore more than one uniform, though he'd never dare say so with a mob at his back. "You keep them here, and their fight becomes yours. And I don't reckon you've got enough fence posts or cartridges to hold off what's coming." Mercer felt his stomach twist. His mind tugged once more toward the image of flames devouring his barn, of neighbors he had drunk with and worked beside now turning rifles against him. And yet behind him, just inside the door, he caught the faint murmur of Apache voices, the low, steady rhythm of men speaking to their children, of women sharing what scraps of bread they had left. And in that sound was something he had long forgotten, the hum of life that was not his own, the presence of more than silence, the proof that beneath the fear lay something worth keeping. He met the sheriff's stare, sweat prickling at his brow despite the cold, and though he did not speak, the steel in his gaze wavered between defiance and desperation, as if to say he had not yet decided whether mercy was worth dying for, but he would not be bullied into deciding otherwise. Harlan grunted, spit into the dirt, and mounted again, his last words thrown like a rope around Mercer's throat. "Think hard before sundown, 'cause once the town moves, no law's gonna stop it." The sheriff's horse kicked dust as he rode off, leaving Mercer alone with the echo of that promise and the crushing knowledge that whatever choice he made, the frontier would demand its price in blood or silence. The night split open with the glow of torches bobbing along the ridge, a river of fire spilling toward the ranch, and John Mercer knew before the first shout cracked the silence that the storm had come for him at last. The mob moved like a single beast, faces twisted in rage, rifles gleaming, their boots stomping to the rhythm of vengeance. And when the first bottle shattered against the barn wall, flames licking skyward, the Apache men burst from the shadows, bows strung and rifles raised, their war cries cutting through the din like lightning splitting the sky. Mercer, heart hammering, snatched his rifle and took his place at the gate, the boards trembling beneath his boots, and when the first shot rang out, the world dissolved into thunder and smoke, the hiss of burning wood and the acrid sting of powder filling his nose as he fired into the chaos, not with the cold detachment of a man defending property, but with the raw fury of one who had chosen mercy and now had to fight for it. Bullets tore through fence posts, sparks rained as torches struck the walls, and the cries of wounded men echoed against the hills. Yet through it all, the Apaches moved with grim purpose, their tall shadows darting through flame and smoke, shielding their women and children while driving back the drunkest, the boldest, those who thought violence could wash away the shame of fear. Mercer found himself shoulder to shoulder with the leader, the man's rifle booming in rhythm with his own, their eyes meeting once in the brief lull between volleys, and in that wordless glance was forged something harder than iron, an understanding that in this night's fire they were not stranger and outcast, but brothers bound by survival. The mob roared again, charging through smoke, but the defenders did not break, their line holding fast, the sisters of the tribe hurling buckets of water at creeping flames, their children clutching each other in the hay while the men fought as though the bones of their ancestors were buried beneath Mercer's soil. The hours bled together into a nightmare of sparks and screams, every breath a gamble against powder and flame, until the torches guttered low, the mob's courage sputtering like their fire, and one by one the shadows fell back into the darkness, carrying their wounded, their curses trailing into the night. Silence returned at last. But it was not the silence of loneliness Mercer had once known. It was the silence of exhaustion, of survivors standing among smoke and ash, their hands blackened, their eyes hollow yet unbroken. The barn smoldered, the fence splintered, the yard littered with spent casings and blood. And Mercer, chest heaving, lowered his rifle, his body trembling as he realized he had not just defended his home, but had chosen his side, throwing his lot in with the outcast, the hunted, and finding in their defiance a purpose fierce enough to burn away fear. The Apaches gathered close, their leader's hand heavy on Mercer's shoulder, a wordless acknowledgement of kinship forged in fire, and as the last torch sputtered out in the dirt, the rancher knew that whatever dawn brought, the frontier had already carved his fate. He was no longer a man alone, but a man bound to others by blood, danger, and the unyielding truth that mercy was worth every bullet fired in its defense. The smoke hung thick in the night air, curling into the stars as if the heavens themselves bore witness, and as the mob stumbled back from the rancher's yard, faces blackened with soot, arms trembling from rage and fatigue, their jeers faltered into uneasy silence, for before them stood not the savage raiders their stories had conjured, but Apache men and women locked arm in arm with John Mercer, their shadows long against the smoldering fence, their bodies shielding his home with the stubborn ferocity of kin defending kin. The sight cracked the mob's certainty like glass under strain, for they had come expecting to see the rancher's barn looted, his cattle driven off, his body strung from the rafters by those he sheltered. Yet here in the smoke and flame they beheld the opposite. Apaches hauling buckets to douse fire, women clutching children beneath their shawls, warriors standing not in conquest but in defense of the very soil Mercer had long tilled alone. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, first soft, then louder, mutterings of doubt as men who had marched on the promise of justice now found themselves staring at something far closer to truth. Neighbors caught in the web of lies spun by fear and hate. One man spat, insisting it was trickery, that savages knew only blood, but even his words rang hollow as his companions shifted uneasily, their torches sagging, their rifles lowering by inches. In the flicker of firelight, more than one saw children huddled in the hay, eyes wide but unafraid, and the sight gnawed at them, reminding them of their own sons and daughters left at home, and suddenly the rage that had carried them here soured in their bellies, curdled by the undeniable fact that these people were not plunderers but survivors no different from themselves, save for the cruelty of soldiers who had already bled them dry. Mercer, chest heaving, rifle heavy in his hands, stepped forward then, his voice ragged but clear, cutting through the crackling timbers. You came for blood, but blood's already been spilled by the same hands that burned their camp, that could burn yours just as quick. His words struck hard, ringing with the authority of a man who had stood his ground against both fear and fire. And though some snarled, too deep in hate to bend, others faltered, eyes darting between smoke-stained rancher and weary Apache until doubt blossomed like cracks in stone. One by one, torches hissed as they dropped into the dirt, their glow sputtering out, and though not all turned away, enough did that the mob's force broke apart, unraveling into scattered knots of men muttering curses half-heartedly, their certainty undone. Silence swelled again, heavy but different now, a silence not of threat but of realization, the air thick with the knowledge that the story they had believed of savages at war with the frontier was no longer so easy to tell. Mercer stood tall in the ashes, the Apache leader at his side, and in that moment the tide turned, not with the clash of bullets but with the quiet crumbling of lies, leaving the mob to retreat into the night carrying doubt heavier than any wound. The dawn broke pale and thin over the blackened earth, smoke still drifting from charred fence posts, the soil littered with brass casings and the faint red stains of battle. Yet John Mercer stood in the yard with a steadiness that surprised even himself. For though ruin hung in the air, the ranch still stood, scarred but unbroken, and beside him the Apache people gathered in quiet resolve, their faces weathered by both grief and survival, their belongings bound as if to depart before the sun rose too high. Their leader's eyes lingered on the horizon, the unspoken truth clear in his stance that they had survived the night, but to remain here would invite fresh danger, more mobs, soldiers, or worse, and so it was better to slip back into the wilderness where their fate, however cruel, was their own to shape. Yet as the women collected children and the men hefted rifles, Mercer felt the weight of silence pressing in again, that old familiar loneliness crouching at the edges of his soul like a wolf waiting to reclaim him. And he realized with a clarity sharp as the morning air that if he let them go, if he watched these weary faces vanish into the horizon, his ranch would return to being what it had always been, an empty shell, a prison of solitude where mercy was only a memory. His hand trembled as he stepped forward, voice raw but unyielding. "This land has room for more than one man." The words startled even him, tumbling from his chest like a vow carved in stone. And for a heartbeat the yard fell utterly still, all eyes fixed on him, suspicion and hope mingling in their gaze, until the Apache leader turned, studying Mercer as though measuring the truth of his soul, and what he saw there made him pause. The silence stretched, filled only by the sigh of wind through scorched grass, until at last the leader gave a slow nod, neither gratitude nor surrender but a recognition that kinship could be forged in fire as surely as blood. The sisters among them straightened, children clutching their skirts with wide eyes, and a murmur rippled through the group, not of flight but of possibility, of roots daring to seek purchase even in hostile soil. Mercer felt the old loneliness loosening its grip, replaced by the hum of life, the sound of voices in the yard, the smell of food shared, the rhythm of work done not by one man's weary hands but by many. And he knew with a certainty deeper than fear that his ranch had ceased to be his alone. It had become something larger, a refuge carved from mercy, a home built on defiance of cruelty. As the sun climbed higher, casting light on the battered barn and the scarred earth, Mercer's heart swelled with a strange, fierce pride. For though the world beyond his fence might never understand, here in this place the silence was broken, replaced by kinship that no fire, no mob, no law could take from him. And as the children's laughter drifted on the wind, he understood at last that the West had given him not just survival, but family.